Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest press briefing, which is especially timely with the current flux in Washington and indeed the world. Our guest is General H.R. McMaster. The briefing is co-hosted by the Ambassadorial Roundtable, whose CEO and President, Dr. Ina von Baer, will join the conversation. In fact, will start the conversation. But at war with ourselves is the general story of working with Trump in his previous term. McMaster served as a General U.S. Army officer for 34 years and retired as a Lieutenant General in 2018. And I will let Ina start the discussion. This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association, and in conjunction with our friend Ina von Baer from the Ambassadorial Roundtable, we are privileged to have General McMaster with us. I was going to say former, the I think it must be long time because you lasted more than most of them. General National
One of
Security
the many
Advisor.
national security advisors for Donald Trump. Right. Exactly.
Yes, I mean, they're more frequent than the popes in the bad times during the Great Schism. Um, and his book, which we're talking about, is At War with Ourselves: My Tour of Duty with the Trump White House. And indeed, it did seem to be a tour of duty when I read it. I mean, it must have been like taking a bath in a snake pit, but we'll come back to that later. Uh, there's a and you have several, how should we say, pithy summaries of Donald Trump and his advisors. I've just mentioned to you, I particularly like the one where you talked about his sort of in advisors engaging in competitive sycophancy, which you see on the press conferences and those people clustered around the table of the Resolute table in the White House. But the book details it, and it goes in. It's sort of deja vu all over again, isn't it, General? Because many of the issues you dealt with there included Iran, tariffs, etc., and they've all come back flaming from the undergrowth suddenly. And it'd be very useful if you could explain to us how you think this is relevant to the current dealing with the problems or not dealing with the problems, as many of us seem to think. Um, Ina, please, do you want to?
Yes. First, thank you and welcome. Thrilled to have you here and excited about the next hour sharing with you sharing with us the most relevant experiences you've had that our audience can benefit from. And I'm going to just jump right in, General. In your book, you're discussing the hostility of domestic politics that's also very prevalent today. It harms our mental well-being and it undermines the ability to govern effectively. And also, you're mentioning about the erosion and the confidence within the United States. So I'm curious, what do you think drives this phenomenon? Because it is a phenomenon, and how does ethnocentricity and strategic narcissism impact the recent American foreign policy?
Well, hey, thanks, Ina and Ian. Great to be with you and with everybody here on the webinar. I think it's really important to understand kind of what has happened within American society. Really since the end of the Cold War, and I think that's what leads up to today. Is in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, victory in the Cold War, and the lopsided victory in the Gulf War, that ushered in a period of optimism, and I think over optimism with a touch of hubris. And there were three assumptions made about the nature of the post-Cold War period. The first, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. That great power competition and rivalry, that was a relic of the past. And then the third assumption was that our prowess, our technological prowess, our military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. And that what happened within America is a series of shocks and disappointments. That over-optimism was in many ways a setup for those shocks and disappointments, including, of course, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the big transitions in the global economy that affected so many Americans associated with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, the loss of manufacturing jobs in the heartland of the United States, the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, toss in an opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
And then the effects of social media, where these companies endeavor to get more and more advertising dollars by more and more clicks, and to get those clicks by showing people more and more extreme content, and to show them, conspiracy theories and everything else. So those traumas combined then with President Trump's election denial, the attack on the Capitol, the COVID epidemic, George Floyd's murder and the violent aftermath. Okay, you got to get the picture. That over-optimism in the 90s gave way to pessimism, and maybe even a touch of resignation in the 2010s, late 2000s. And so what we had is the pendulum swung toward pessimism. And this is where I think we have this kind of this strategic narcissism, in that we think that what we do or choose not to do in the world is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome, and don't acknowledge the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others enjoy, especially rivals, enemies, adversaries. And so what you're seeing play out in the Trump administration is the manifestation, the reflection of a lot of these frustrations among Americans who think, that disengagement from the world is what we ought to prioritize, either because we're the problem in the world, or these problems are intractable, or because we have a lot of work to do at home, right? To strengthen our own economy, to strengthen our own homeland security. We should focus more on our hemisphere. So this is kind of the debate that's going on within the administration between those who are, America first but internationalists, and those who are in the retrenchment or sort of neo-isolationist camp.
But those people, General, they're often very contradictory. They can believe several impossible things together before breakfast, and mutually contradictory things as well, because they say, America first and America go it alone. But then they really claim, as you were hinting, the right to interfere in other countries without consulting what they might think. The idea that you can decide what's going to happen in Greenland or in Denmark, or the other parts of the world, without taking, or Canada in particular, without taking into account how those people think. I mean, the Vance in a China shop in Europe is exemplary on this.
Yeah, I don't think those are the big issues, man. I really don't. I mean, I think, a lot of what President Trump says is outlandish, but really what he's trying to get at is an issue that is valid. So, for example, on Greenland, okay, Arctic security was the big issue there. On Panama, it was China's ability to use companies that have to act as an arm of the Chinese Communist Party to undermine sovereignty of countries. But of course, with Donald Trump, he wants to disrupt what needs to be disrupted, but he's so disruptive, and this is a big theme of the book, that he disrupts his own agenda. So the message in these areas would be, for on Arctic security, on Panama Canal security, and it would be to reinforce sovereignty, right, and to be on the side of Greenland's and Denmark's sovereignty or Panama's sovereignty. But when he says, "Hey, I'm going to take the canal," or annex Greenland and so forth, I think that's not a serious threat, but it undermines his own agenda, undermines his own best argument for getting at the issue that drew his attention to Greenland or drew his attention to Panama in the first place.
Well, he's already shown that in Canada this week, where I think possibly his intervention guaranteed the outsider winning as opposed to his ally. I mean, to be blessed by Trump is not a winning strategy in much of the world.
Well, and this is a theme in the book as well, is that, and what I often said to President Trump, and I tell several stories about this in the book, is that, he what he's used to is talking to his political base, right? The people, who were traumatized by those blows that I just described, right, in the 2000s. The people who think that, government is bloated, it's inefficient, government doesn't care about the American people. And a lot of these, sentiments I mean, they're not unfounded, right? I mean,
No, no,
these are, emotions and opinions that are based in really what they've experienced, right? Anyway, but Trump will talk to that base. That's who he talks to all the time. And on many occasions, I would say to him, "Hey, Mr. President, when you say this, the American people will pay passing attention to it, right? It'll be maybe on cable news for a day. But whatever you say, international audiences will study very carefully, and it will have big impact." And so I always tried to sensitize him to how his words would be received abroad, and I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, he would say, "Okay, okay, General," and modify those comments to make the point he wants to make, but to make it more effectively, especially in connection with those overseas audiences. If you look at his speeches from that 13 months I was national security advisor, look at the speech that he gave in Saudi Arabia, the speech that he gave in Warsaw, the speech that he gave in Da Nang at the APEC summit. Look at his State of the Union address, for example, the UN General Assembly speech, the 2017 version. These, I think, are speeches that contain, I think, messages to allies, partners internationally that are positive, right, and emphasize the common agenda. And this is what's missing today, right? I mean, this is what bothers me probably more than anything else, is that really the priorities for Donald Trump are pretty clear: deregulation to generate economic growth, economic security, border security, certainly, burden sharing on defense, right? I mean, this is reciprocity in trade. You know what this sounds like to me? It sounds like the Draghi report to me. It sounds like the speech that the former president of Finland, Niinistö, gave at Chatham House recently. So I think that Donald Trump's agenda it aligns with the European agenda, for example. And what's missing is that positive agenda. Everything's negative. Enough with the negativity is what I want to say, and let's focus on this positive agenda and help President Trump get out of his own way on these issues.
Okay,
well, in a
great.
way, he's
Got
almost
it.
an
So,
idios. I'm sorry. Could I just finish this thought of
yeah.
that? No, he doesn't actually know much about history and the back of the world, but he has certain fixed. I'm not quite sure I call them principles. Idée fixe of tariffs as a result of the anti-immigrant crackdown, for example, which appealed to his base. And he was, which is why I thought I was not as surprised as many of my colleagues when he was first elected, because I could see that he tapped the popular disgruntlement with
Yeah,
establishment
but
politicians.
Ian, hey, look what happens when you don't secure your border. Look what the Biden administration did. I mean, I'll tell you, a lot of Trump's policies from his first term, the value of them only became apparent to Americans after Biden reversed them with disastrous consequences. Right? I mean, not securing your southern border, granting parole status to anybody who comes across the border. I mean, that doesn't work, right? So look at the conciliatory approach he took to Iran instead of maximum pressure. How did that work out? I mean, I could go policy by policy of what President Biden reversed, and they were disastrous. So I mean, Trump's impulses are one thing, right? But his policies from the first administration, foreign policy decisions that he made, I think were generally sound, with a couple of exceptions, which I write about in the book, especially when he reversed good decisions he made because of the people who get in his ear and who give him that message: hey, this is going to make you look weak. This is going to alienate your base, and play to his ego in a way that got him, I think, to make counterproductive decisions. And of course, foremost among those, I think, was the reversal of his Afghanistan and South Asia policy.
Right.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Do you want to come in?
I was just wanting to piggyback and go and say, so what do you see as our top three threats facing the U.S. today? And how do you suggest we rebuild bipartisan support for this foreign policy in order to counter possible self-defeat?
Yeah. Well, I think the most significant threat from a national security perspective, I would call the axis of aggressors, the degree to which the two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia are working together, aiding and abetting one another, and have brought into the fold Iran and North Korea. I mean, I think the degree to which each of them are aiding and abetting the other is really unprecedented in the post-Cold War period. And of course, what I'm talking about is the degree to which China is underwriting the war in Ukraine. And in fact, I think in many ways, using Russia to fight a proxy war against Europe and the West, doing so by buying Russian energy in quantities to feed Putin's ATM that he needs to keep the war machine going, as well as providing him with the electronics and the hardware and the equipment necessary to continue the onslaught against the Ukrainian people. Of course, who would have thought, that North Korean soldiers would be fighting alongside Russian soldiers in the first major land war in Europe since World War II. They've provided also about $20 billion equivalent of support to Russia in the form of not only the people who are fighting there, but also 8 million rounds of artillery, shells, and missiles. Iran is providing Shahed drones and missiles. What are both of those two members of the Axis getting in return? I think they're getting technical assistance on their nuclear programs, missile programs, and conventional militaries from the Russians.
And petro rubles, I presume, as well. They're in it for the cash.
So
Well,
what are
yeah, that's right. But then also China's buying 97% of Iran's oil exports. So I think threat number one, axis of aggressors who have each of them have their own agendas in mind. But what they really want to do is tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules and a new balance of power, essentially, that favors their authoritarian form of governance. And in China's case, its statist mercantilist economic model. The second big threat, I think, what we have are related to this, but are threats to critical supply chains that fuel the global economy and the dangerous situation that we have in connection with so much of the world's manufacturing being concentrated on the southeastern coast of China, and with China in control and this axis of aggressors being in control of so much of the world's critical supplies. And then the third, of course, also related to this is to this axis of aggressors is the threat of proliferation of the most destructive weapons on Earth, and the degree to which those who possess these weapons would be unscrupulous in terms of who they transfer them to, including perhaps to jihadist terrorist organizations. So I would say those are the top three from my perspective: axis of aggressors, the threat to critical supply chains. This involves energy security as well as the various critical upstream components that are necessary for everything from battery manufacturing to manufacturing of electronics, and so much of what we rely on is related obviously to microprocessors, computer chips, and so forth. And the degree to which the energy security issue is connected now, obviously, to artificial intelligence, demands on energy, and then the third I think agenda item I think for the free world, excuse me, should be this grave danger of proliferation.
So what should the U.S. do to counter China in counter authoritarian regime period? And what should the American public, or what should America understand about adversaries like China?
Well, I mean, this axis of aggressors is profoundly weak at the moment, I believe. And I believe we could impose costs on them that could greatly limit their ability to continue to support one another and to support violence and aggression everywhere from Ukraine to the Middle East, to the South China Sea, to the threat to Taiwan, to the Himalayan frontier. Right? I mean, I think if you look at Russia now sitting on piles of cash it can't convert. It's spending, I think, something like 45% of its budget on defense, which is not sustainable. Russia has a severe labor shortage, and they're losing 30 to 40,000 casualties a month in Ukraine. It's not sustainable. I don't think.
Agreed.
And then in China, China has the engines of the Chinese economy are sputtering, including the engine of their economy that relied on on massive foreign investment, the dumb money flows into Chinese index funds, as well as the targeted investment in which Western investors seemed intent on underwriting our own demise in China. I think finally, they're getting the recognition that there's tremendous geostrategic risk, but also reputational risk with investment in China, right? I mean, I think enabling genocide, should be an ESG issue, for example. And then you have, the massive industrial manufacturing base, which Xi Jinping is protecting because he's preparing for war, but he's protecting it in a way that is building even greater vulnerabilities into his economy because of the massive overcapacity, overproduction, and maybe not enough markets to dump those goods into. Then you have, the real estate sector, which is in real has a real problem associated with it now, and the debt associated with that, and the overproduction, overcapacity, and the consumer economy in China hasn't gotten off the ground. So hey, China's got some real issues. Iran is having rolling blackouts. Companies manufacturing in Iran is only going for like 3 days a week for some of these factories because of energy shortages. The theocratic regime there has destroyed their economy based on the corruption, right? So I think the time now is for all of us to be strong against this axis of aggressors. There's this talk of this, reverse Nixon, reverse Kissinger, and separating China and Russia from one another. I think we should glue them together, not only because they deserve each other, but we can begin to hang the problems that they develop for themselves around their collective necks, like lodestones. So, I think we have tremendous opportunities if we act together. And when I say we, I mean the world's largest economies of the United States, the EU, of course, UK, and Japan, and I think India, based on this recent horrific attack by Pakistan, which is essentially a client state of China, combined with the threat from China, will understand that the nostalgia for the not-aligned movement is misplaced. and will, I think, see their interests increasingly aligned with those of the free world. But of course, one of the biggest impediments we've had toward this positive agenda of confronting the axis of aggressors, strengthening our economies, making our supply chains more resilient, strengthening our mutual defense, everything that we've been talking about, has been President Trump's penchant, for insulting and undervaluing, insulting our allies and undervaluing the alliances. I think he's going to come around on this, by the way. I think thanks to the axis of aggressors, thanks to the nature of the Putin regime, the Xi Jinping regime, the theocratic dictatorship in Iran, President Trump's desire for a big deal with them, with these adversaries, that hope, that desire for that will be dashed. And what you're going to see is a series of negotiations, bilateral trade agreements, and ultimately, I think a trade agreement with the EU that lower these tariffs to about a 10% rate, because as Ian said, he loves tariffs. And this goes back to the 70s. I mean, I can tell you more about how I see his background, generating, this sort of affinity for tariffs and other actions. And then we'll get back to normal. We'll stop insulting our neighbors. I mean, really, Canada, come on, you're going to have to, there's going to be a renegotiation of USMCA. So we will back ourselves. America will back itself into, under the Trump administration, a strategy that I think is appropriate, which is a strengthening of the economic relationships with a common agenda, as I mentioned, on deregulation, economic growth, energy security. I think what you're seeing now, certainly with the Merz government in Germany, is really now finally a willingness for Europe to take responsibility for its own security. When you see this animosity toward Europe, you have to try to understand it through the lens of what I was describing of these disappointments in the 2000s, but also the fact that the EU accounts for 17% of world GDP and 50% of social spending. So a lot of Americans, and this is important, strategic empathy, right? Which is the way to get past strategic narcissism. This is the phrase I borrowed from the great historian Zachary Shore, right? Should help you realize that a lot of Americans believe that they have underwritten Europe's social programs. And they're not entirely wrong about that, right? So I think what you will have when the Zeitenwende that Olaf Scholz declared but didn't act on, now Merz is acting on it. So are other European countries. I think what you're going to get at the end of this is a repairing of the transatlantic relationship. The bridge is going to be strengthened, maybe through the UK, maybe through Georgia Maloney, and however it happens, right? It's going to be strengthened. And you're going to have a Europe that's much stronger and a much better partner economically and from a defense perspective. So you might say, hey, that sounds kind of Pollyannish or over optimistic, but I think that's how it's going to play out.
I can't help thinking
you're right on the money. Yes, at the G7, Georgia led the way, and she led the way for everybody. Very impressive and a nice and welcome change. And so, just to clarify what you were saying before, are you suggesting that a strong approach to commit sustained support for Ukraine and increase costs on Russia would be something the United States would consider, and then what would be the end game if the United States joins Europe in the effort to support Ukraine? So would it be should it be negotiated settlement or frozen conflict?
I think what you have, if you get a ceasefire, I don't think there's going to be progress toward an enduring settlement, right? I mean, that has been impossible in the past, right? I mean, you've had obviously the violation of the Budapest Agreement after that was from 1994, with the initial invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Minsk Agreement, which was violated. I mean, there's no agreement with Russia that's going to lead to some kind of an enduring peace, because at least the Putin regime and the hyper nationalist regime that may continue even after he's gone will not moderate their aspiration to restore the Russian Empire. I don't think, unless there's a fundamental change in the nature of that government.
I mean, what we have is the reverse of the old Teddy Roosevelt doctrine. I mean, he was using a limp stick for Russia and usually using a big stick on Zelensky in a sort of epic public global display of gratuitous humiliation for Zelensky, and I don't think Trump will ever be taken seriously again as a result.
Yeah, also the blows that were delivered, to the kind of will of Ukraine associated with the suspension of assistance. But you have to remember, one of the reasons we're in this situation is, I would say, the fecklessness of the Biden administration. And remember, in 2021 to 2022, what did the Biden administration do? President Biden went to Geneva to lay out his red lines for Putin, which means that's a green light for everything else. He suspended lethal assistance to Ukraine to allay Putin's security concerns. He pulled our ships out of the Black Sea. He evacuated our advisors out of Ukraine, and he evacuated and scuttled our embassy, right? So it looked like a green light to me that he gave to Putin. Then we came in to support them, but we debated every measure. Should we provide tanks? And we provided like 31 tanks. Are you kidding me? And then, should we provide them with sophisticated air defense? I don't know. Let's debate it for months.
Well, got missiles
yes
that were.
No. I mean, it was so. One of the reasons we're in the situation we're in is the weakness and fecklessness of the Biden administration. Now, that gave Trump an opportunity. He could have come in from the very beginning, and he could have, because he likes to criticize his predecessors, criticized the Biden administration for that. And he could have, I think, allayed the concerns of his base by offering a long-term, low-interest loan to Ukraine, like we gave to Finland after World War I, so Finland could defend itself. And guess where that money from that loan would be spent? In the United States, right? In our defense industrial base. And so, anyway, I think he blew the opportunity. But as I mentioned, what I think he will do, thank you, Vladimir Putin, who we should all send flowers and chocolates to. He will back in.
I'd like to send a wreath.
He will back in to I think what we would regard as an appropriate strategy of supporting Ukraine so it can defend itself, to convince Vladimir Putin that he cannot accomplish his objectives through the continued use of force, get a ceasefire that way, right? And then play a longer game that involves, ensuring that Ukraine remains sovereign, gets back on, gets reconstructed, and has the defense capabilities to defend itself, right? And this is why this mineral agreement could be part of that, right? The mineral agreement would be positive by binding the U.S. and Ukraine together from an economic perspective that can lend itself also to an enduring security relationship. And hey, it would also involve, guaranteed access to at least the ports in Western Ukraine, depending on where the ceasefire lines are drawn and so forth. So, hey, I think that there is a plausible way to at least a ceasefire, but only through strength. So this is part of President Trump's dissonance, right? Where he carries these opposing ideas in his head. Peace through strength, but the desire for this big deal and the belief that only he can get to some kind of an agreement with authoritarians like Vladimir Putin, right? And you're seeing that dissonance kind of play out. I think ultimately, based on the nature of of Putin's regime in Russia, the default is going to go back to what I think we would agree would be the most effective strategy for ensuring a sovereign Ukraine that can defend itself.
So
this is reducing geopolitics to a transactional. The mineral deal looks to much of the rest of the world as though the president is saying, we'll defend you as long as you pay us, as long as you, allow a straightforward 19th century resource grab in return, then we will come and help you up to a point, because it's not an unqualified offer. But, there's an issue of principles, and I think both of you mentioned it earlier about international norms. And if you have turned round to the United Nations and say, we don't care about your international courts, we don't care about human rights in other countries, whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine, because we're waiting for the check. It does send a big signal, and it weakens the apparatus that's a very faulty apparatus that's been built up over the years after Nuremberg and World War II. The last gasp of Yalta, Tehran, and the rest of it, that we were building a new international order.
Hey, Ian, are you suggesting that the UN is an effective organization?
No, I'm saying,
or the International Criminal Court, or the International.
Actually, I am, because I do think that the International Criminal Court has succeeded beyond all measure. I was at the UN when it was being negotiated, and none of the drafters of it expected that they would get somebody like Milosevic in the court.
Yeah, but I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about today with the indictments of Netanyahu and everything else. I mean, listen, I'll tell you, I really think that it's a big mistake to surrender our citizens' sovereignty to these international organizations, which have been infiltrated and subverted by those who are advocating for measures that cut against us. I mean, look at the Human Rights Council. I mean, I really don't mind Trump pulling out of that. Look at the World Health Organization.
The Human Rights Council was actually drafted according to U.S. specifications. I was following the specifications when they put in all the provisos to protect the U.S. as much as possible. And the U.S. got as much as it could do out of the drafting for that, and the Rome Treaty on the International Court. It had so many cutouts. The rest of the world was bending over backwards to get the U.S. in. And then
Ian. I mean, that this kind of sort of deep affinity for international organizations is one of the reasons why President Trump is so popular, right? I mean, this soft-headed cosmopolitanism that has led to, I think, the surrendering of sovereignty. It's why he was so sympathetic to Brexit, right? It's why he dislikes the EU. He believes that that countries have surrendered the sovereignty of their citizens to these faceless international bodies, which often act against our own interests, right? And so I'm just explaining that's his sentiment. And again, if you want to try to understand him, you've got to at least try
I appreciate where he's coming from. I just don't agree with it.
Sure, yeah.
So you mentioned security, you mentioned international organizations. I'm going to pivot to the Middle East because it is a hotbed and will always be a hotbed. And I'm going to compile that with your history lessons. And Truman, that's your favorite, who always said that the only thing new in the world is the history we don't know, and sometimes we don't even learn from it, which is a prime example for the Middle East. In U.S. policy, current U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel's security and Arab normalization and Palestinian statehood is changing at a very fast pace. Now, how do you think the U.S. should respond, or what would the actions be in the U.S. for the U.S. to take in the Middle East? And if you, HR, would consider Iran's proxy network post October 7, especially in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, what is your take on that?
Okay, so I'm a big believer, as you mentioned, in understanding how the recent past produced a president as the first step of making a projection into the future. And I think that really, whenever you think things can't get worse in the Middle East, they actually can get worse in the Middle East. And the Middle East doesn't adhere, as Ken Pollock once said, the Middle East doesn't adhere to Las Vegas rules, right? Things that happen there don't stay there. And of course, Europe has experienced that in a profound way with the migration crisis associated mainly with the Syrian civil war and the episodes of mass homicide there that led to half the Syrian population being dead, wounded, or displaced. It's had a big effect on Europe. It's had a big effect on countries in the region. And certainly it's been devastating to the Syrian people. And so what I see is a disturbing pattern of disengagement from the Middle East that set conditions for a number of developments that cut against, I think, the interests of the people in the region, the interest of the United States, and the interest of Israel as being part of the people in the region, but but also the Arab world as well. And that is the setting conditions for Iran to extend hegemonic influence across the region. This was made possible, I think, by the complete disengagement from Iraq and disengagement diplomatically as well as politically, especially associated with the election in Iraq in 2009, 2010, when Iyad Allawi won, and then the Iranians threw the election to Maliki, and then our complete disengagement from Iraq that really, that really led to the return of sectarian policies that in turn led to a sense of beleaguerment again among the Sunni population, that led to the rise of ISIS, that by 2014 was in control of territory the size of Great Britain, had attracted 40,000 people to their cause, had created a humanitarian catastrophe in Syria and Iraq. And then they launched 96, 97 external attacks, from Brussels to Marseille to Paris, to shooting down an airliner and inspiring an attack in San Bernardino, right? And then, of course, concurrent with this and associated, I think, with the decision not to do anything about the Syrian civil war, like create safe zones or anything like we did maybe even in Iraq after the Shia uprising and the Kurdish uprising, by creating the Green Line to protect the Kurds after the 91 Gulf War, doing nothing in Syria, not enforcing the Red Line after the Assad regime used the most heinous weapons on earth to commit mass murder. That created conditions for Iran to pursue this strategy, which it's been pursuing for a long time, which is to foment sectarian violence, to keep the Arab world perpetually weak by keeping it enmeshed in conflict, and to use that weakness to extend its essentially land bridge to the Mediterranean, to strengthen proxies on the border of Israel, including Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, and to surround Israel with a ring of fire. I believe that on October 7th, 2023, Ayatollah Khamenei was looking at his to-do list, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to destroy Israel off my to-do list." And he was emboldened by that to do that because he perceived weakness. He saw weakness in our inability to sustain support for Ukraine. This is when we had an interruption in our supply of Ukraine associated with the narrow, thin Republican majority in the House of Representatives. He saw difficulties in the relationship between the United States and Israel. He saw weakness in Israel associated with the judicial reform efforts and the mass protests. And he said, okay, now's the time to go. And what happened is Iran, like Russia did in 2022, has overextended itself China is overextending itself at this moment. And you could say North Korea has by sending troops to Russia. This is why they're in a position of profound weakness. And what Israel did is it disregarded the advice of the United States. Don't go into this neighborhood in Gaza. Well, they went in
and that's still got the weapons and the money and the diplomatic.
That's where they liberated many of the hostages. Don't be aggressive against Hezbollah. Don't attack into southern Lebanon. And then they decapitated Hezbollah and weakened Hezbollah to the degree that it had a cascading effect and collapsed the Assad regime as well. So I think what you have is a real weakening of the tentacles of the octopus, but actually the Iranian regime is profoundly weak at this moment for what I discussed already. And Israel demonstrated their military weakness. Was in October was the last strikes against Iran, where they flew 140 aircraft into Iran, ran laps around Tehran, struck all their undeclared nuclear sites as well as their defense systems, and left without any losses. Okay, so
but after a year and a half of the Gaza war, Hamas is still there. Israel's reputation is at all-time low, where even former allies are wringing their hands and talking about genocide. And we have, we have a complete disregard of anything that passed for international law, even as a rallying course of saying we're going to defend human rights. It's very difficult to defend human rights if you're dropping 2,000 pound American bombs on the tops of housing complexes and tents, because it does not look good for your image or for Israel. So unlimited support for Israel, it's transactional elsewhere. But in realist terms, the blank check for Netanyahu and his rather unpopular at home zealots is ricocheting right through American policy across the world.
Okay, thank you for that statement, Ian. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well,
I think what your position is indicative of the fundamental misframing of the situation in Israel, because you didn't even mention the word Hamas. Didn't even mention it. So
I did. I said
Hamas. So Israel's responsible.
Of a war to rid
okay,
them.
hey, listen, Ian. I mean, what you're saying is that this situation is due all to Israel. Go back to the October 7th attacks. Listen to what the Hamas leader said. We know.
Sorry,
Israel,
General. I was very carefully.
We know Israel's weakness. Their weakness is they love life, and we can take that away from them.
It doesn't look like that's
our strength. I'm quoting Hamas leaders.
Beirut.
Our strength is that we love death. Do you think they didn't know what was going to happen after October 7th? Did you think it wasn't one of their objectives to get as many innocent Palestinians killed as possible? So this is what really bothers me about this.
I'm
situation.
afraid I was very careful.
If you're pro-Palestinian,
into the morals of the various sides, I was talking about the American response, which has been unqualified support for people who are the rest of the world, for a government that the rest of the world regards as unbalanced, possibly genocidal, and many people in Israel think so as well. So we're putting the full faith and credit. And it wasn't just Trump, of course, because Biden was even more complicit in this beforehand. He didn't even get the transactional elements in there. So this is how it looks to the rest of the world. And how the US looks to the rest of the world is extremely important for whether there's any type of feasible world order. You'd be the first to admit that, I am, how should you say, ambivalent about whether the UN would be better served with the US getting out or vice versa. I mean, but one thing many people agree with is the UN is never going to be effective unless it has an active involvement by the United States. Because, well, look, in the end, Putin has some residual nuclear weapons. It's a petrostate with nukes. Its currency is hanging on a pipeline, as you were pointing out, and shrewd assessment of its inherent weakness. But how the US appears is extremely important in Europe and the rest, because they look still to the US with increasing despair and exhaustion as the beacon of all of the things that we won in 1945.
Ian, in HR, I think from Balfour to now, from the Balfour Declaration to now, Israel has a right to exist, and that is what they're fighting for. When attacked, they respond, and then the rest of the world needs to decide what happened. And there's going to be always opinions about the Middle East, but
Hey, I'll just say one last thing. If Ian's done with his lecture, I'll just say, hey, listen, if you're pro-Palestinian, you should be anti-Hamas. Why can't there be a better life for Palestinians in Gaza in particular, but also in the West Bank at the time, but especially Gaza? It's because there can be no return to security unless Hamas is out. As Ian said, Hamas still has the guns. Who's going to be the mayor of Gaza? Who's going to put up their arms to say, I'll do it? Do you see what happened when the mass protests against Hamas happened about 3 or 4 weeks ago? And how they brutally murdered those who they identified who were in those protests?
We should not be forced into a false binary position. Hamas doesn't represent all Palestinians, as you're correctly pointing out. But remember, Hamas was the sort of brainchild of Israeli intelligence at one point to undermine the secular leftists in Palestine.
Come on. Really? Okay, now I will buy that Netanyahu.
Even now, we're propping up Abbas in the West Bank when he's ineffectual. He is corrupt. I better be careful there with libel laws. But we're propping up because faute de mieux. We don't want any real opposition there. Barghouti's in jail and going to stay there, and he's the most.
Sorry, guys. I have 5 minutes left. But what I'll say is, thank you, Ian. Okay, what do you want to talk about next, you guys?
I would like.
Well, what's going to happen with Donald Trump?
Thanks. It's been great to be with you guys, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for your time.
Okay. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
I appreciate it too. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our audience.
And we have, from the Foreign Press Association, we have more briefings coming up in the near future, covering the usual range of subjects. We're going to have a seminar on the threats to foreign journalists coming into the US from the current administration, and we have a distinguished immigration lawyer explaining the pitfalls for journalists coming across the border and resident journalists here who are going in and out because it's all threatened. We hope that you can come to those. Okay, look, thank you very much, Ian.
Yes. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely rest of the week. Thanks, Ian, in New York. And everybody who joined us, thank you for your time.
And thanks to the General, who was very candid and forthright, as he was in the National Security Council from his book.
Okay, bye-bye.